Welcome to Trinity Radio. I'm Braxton Hunter, and I'm so excited because this is a special video with a new friend of mine, and he is someone who has been on some pretty big platforms talking about this issue that we're going to be discussing today, which is miracles. Some cases that, at the very least, I hope will lead you to the conclusion that it's more reasonable to believe in the miraculous than perhaps I thought that it was. And my friend that I want to introduce to you today is Caleb Jackson, and Caleb is here. Caleb, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Braxton. I really appreciate it.
What do people need to know about you as far? We'll put whatever links you want in the description. So, but what would you want to say to point people towards your stuff or whatever you want to say about yourself too? You feel free.
Yeah, so I am just kind of a Christian who likes to learn things and write. I wish I had something more interesting to say to that, but I, over the past several years, have just kind of really gotten to theology and apologetics, probably about 5 years ago now. And that just really inspired me to kind of write my own stuff and do my own stuff and kind of fill in the gaps where I thought there may need to be more intermediate work and so forth. So I've written intermediate to pop level books on the resurrection. I've written a pop level book on theodicy, and it kind of gets into the topic we're talking about now. But miracles is the book that I've been working on since close to 3 years now. And unlike the other two, this one's I'm expecting to be pretty academic, pretty scholarly. I'm close to 500 pages or so as it is. So I'm really excited for that book. Wow. And for how that comes out. Yeah, absolutely. So I'm really looking forward to that. And I really wanted to write a book that I think dealt with the topic not only thoroughly, but had enough cases, because there are lots of really good academic materials out there and pop level stuff that deals with philosophical arguments like for miracles, like dealing with David Hume and so forth. In fact, that's the majority. If you look up arguments for God's existence in like Phil papers, at the very bottom, I think it's the last or like second to last is the argument for miracles. Like if you compare to the Kalam or the teleological argument or even Pascal's wager, it has much less published on it. And even most of those are just philosophical arguments of can testimony be enough to verify a miracle. There's comparatively very little written in terms of actually documenting cases. There are some exceptions to this, like Craig Keener is very famous for having his giant tome on miracles that he published back in around 2011. But I think with Keener's work, although it is certainly a trailblazer and certainly a very great work to start it off, I found it a little bit disappointing in that I think it deals more with the quantity of cases and not so much the quality. And so I wanted to kind of take that and make it where we're looking at specific cases, going to the depths and looking at that. So there are other people out there like GMRI, the Global Medical Research Institute, Kenny Gunther Brown, Josh Brown, who have been publishing good works on this, whether it's in medical journals or books by Harvard University Press that do document some of these. And I kind of wanted to go off of that as well. But I think that I wanted to take the philosophical arguments and combine them with the case studies and make a robust work and not just, one or the other as a lot of other works have done. So that's kind of what I've been trying to do as of recent. But yeah.
Well,
so
what I love about miracles, Caleb, is, and I've got another podcast, Supernatural Stories, where I try to listen to what just normal people, everyday people who've had experiences or believe they've had experiences and let them talk. But this is gripping to the everyday person, believer or non-believer, I think, in a way that perhaps some of the more philosophical apologetic stuff that's more rigorous, syllogisms and things like, not that you haven't formulated miracle stuff into those same sorts of arguments, but to the average person, if you put up the Kalam and explain it, well, a percentage of that audience is going to be really excited by that and may want to get into apologetics. But with miracles, if you show them some pictures or show them a video or put someone up there to talk about it, this just, and it's like Mike Licona said when he was on our show sometime back, he said, if you've experienced something that classically would have been described as supernatural, then you just know then. And it's so it's very, very interesting and powerful, and I love it. And so I can't wait to get to this presentation that you're going to share.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a good point, Braxton, because most people in the world don't believe in God because they've read the Kalam cosmological argument or the contingency argument. There are some out there who are the more analytic people, but if God was as accessible to that, where you would have to become a PhD or be very well read in contemporary cosmology to really be justified in believing his existence, I think that would be a horrible catalyst for like divine hiddenness. It would make it far worse if that's the only way you could be justified. So I think there's appeal to people like Alvin Plantinga when they talk about reformed epistemology and religious experience, right? That the intuition that we kind of know God exists, and that parlays to supernatural encounters where people say, I had an experience with God. Sometimes they mean I felt the Holy Spirit, and it's a bit more, abstract. And sometimes they mean I saw a person healed. I saw an answer to prayer. And I think that's the reason why most people believe. And I don't think that's even like contentious, right?
Well, let me
So
ask you right here, Caleb.
yeah,
That second category that it seems to have some sort of sensory involvement or whatever. Have
right.
have you ever personally experienced? I think most Christians haven't. They've experienced this sort of awareness of the presence of God and those sorts of things. But have you ever experienced anything that would have classically been termed as a supernatural event in your life?
I would actually say no, which people are surprised when I say that because the topic I'm looking into, right?
Mm-hmm.
But no, the most I've had is like, hearing a worship song at a conference or something and feeling this like absolute sense of joy or peace. Like I felt that, but nothing that I would say that I couldn't rule out as psychological if I wanted to, right? Nothing that I could like for sure fire. Like I know that was God and I know it wasn't just myself
Right. Yeah.
wanting something to be true. So yeah, in that way I have not. I do however, have friends who have claimed that. I have friends who claim that they've had literal like waking visual visions of Jesus appearing before them. Um, I'm not here to validate or invalidate that. I don't think it's my position to say whether or not God did or did not do that. But I am both I am both envious of that and I'm also both humbled by that, because I think that, and I don't want to go off too much there, but I think that one reason why not everyone has access to miracles, right? The reason why it doesn't perform to everybody is because, among many reasons, we all have diversity of testimonies, and that itself is a good thing. But we also have to really trust people, because the fact that we don't always experience these ourselves and we have to take someone's word at it, I think allows us to humble ourselves. And so when you look at something like the New Testament, where the women are the first ones to see the resurrected Jesus, and that was in that culture, that would have been very scandalous, because the testimony of women was typically not accepted the same rate as men's were, generally speaking. And you can even see that with people like David Hume, who criticized miracles, where they were saying, oh, these are only reported in ignorant and barbarous nations. Now, that's not PC by today's standards. You couldn't get away with saying that, because Hume was basically implying non-white countries. He was an 18th century Englishman who was pro-slavery. We don't have to sugarcoat it. That's basically what he was implying. But even though that obviously isn't true, I do think that people have unintentional prejudices, where people who see or report miracles are thought of as like credulous or superstitious, and not, we enlightened Westerners are too good for this, and this is something that only the silly rural farmers or people in third world countries still believe in, which is just statistically not true. I think that there have been polls that say something around the lines of like 1 in 3 Americans believes they've seen a miracle. There was even a 2004 study of American doctors. We're talking about like medical professionals in America. 75% of them believed miracles still happened, and 55% of them, over half of them, said that they have witnessed a healing that they thought was miraculous, but defined as something they didn't think they could explain naturally following prayer. So that's a lot of witnesses. That's hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. Now, I'm not here to say that those are all legitimate. I think most of them probably are not like genuinely inexplicable, but that's still hundreds of thousands of cases and hundreds of millions if you're counting literally everyone on earth who reports these. And I'm saying even if 98% of those are not credible, that still leaves you with several thousand that we shouldn't just hand wave away. So I do think that these are something that needs to be taken seriously, and that's something that is starting to be discussed more in the contemporary literature. As I said, books published by Harvard and Oxford that deal with this question. So I'm really excited to see where this goes in the next 10, 20, 30 years.
Did you say that was a 2002 study?
2004 study.
2004 study says 55% of medical doctors. Is that just
American
medical doctors across the board? Okay.
I believe they've seen a miracle, yes.
How 55%?
Believe that they've witnessed a miracle. 75% believe that they still happen. Yeah.
Yeah, that's an impressive number on its own. But the 55% that claim they've seen one or think they've seen one, that is incredible. All right. So should we move into the presentation time then?
Yeah, we can. I don't like the word presentation because it wasn't something overly formal. I just have like brief criteria and like a few cases, and we can kind of
Sure.
see where we go from there. But yeah, we can get into that if you like.
I love your humility, and you were talking about humility, but I appreciate your humility that you're saying, look, I'm not saying that I'm some sort of an expert, but
Right.
you have put together some facts that we still have to deal with, whether you're an expert or not, right? So
Right.
let's move in here. All right. So unfortunately, we are hindered by the fact that we are not SpaceX and we have limited technology, and so I have to advance the slides for Caleb. So
Yeah.
you just tell me when, Caleb. But I'm gonna. And I'm. Is it okay if I stop and ask you questions?
Oh, absolutely. I would prefer you do that actually.
Okay. All
The
right.
only thing I'm looking at now is I tried to get the color palette to match your general background, the green and teal, and I think I did a good
I
job
didn't
of
even
it.
think
I could use more green though,
it's
but
pretty good. It's pretty good. I
yeah,
like it. Yeah.
yeah,
Thank you for
I
that.
could have done that more. Yeah. So yeah, you
So
can go to the first. Go ahead.
yeah,
Sorry.
and before we do, I should say, if I haven't said this anywhere previously in the video, my understanding is that one of the slide. Well, I know because I've seen the slide presentation, and there is toward the end of this presentation, particularly, there is a couple of
Mhm.
graphic images, not sexually
Mhm.
graphic, but in terms of like,
Violence. Yeah.
difficult to look at violent situations, and so,
Right.
or gory, I guess, type situations. So just know that, and you've got some time to get there because we're gonna take some
And I'll
time to get there.
sign off before we get to that slide. It has
Oh,
a
that's
thing,
nice.
so I'm not.
Thank you. Thank you.
It won't jump scare. You won't be a surprise. So
All right.
um,
Mostly
yeah.
PG-13 presentation here. All right.
Yeah. Right. So yeah. So when I think the first thing is a miracle is already fairly difficult to define, and I don't want to get into the whole ontology of it because people debate whether a miracle is God simply intervening, or God has to intervene in a way that's contrary to laws of nature. Is God always intervening in nature and only does it differently? There's a lot of debates when it comes to the ontology of that, but I think we can say that a miracle is something that typically happens. That could only happen with supernatural intervention in that kind of way. So the question is, how do we typically get from a weird anomalous event that we don't know the cause of to saying that it's a miracle, right? Because there are things that are inexplicable that I don't think we would necessarily say is miraculous. Now, colloquially, people said that at the time. You have, when the Mets won the World Series in the I think it was 1969, 1960s. They were called the Miracle Mets, right? And so people, I think, overuse the word miracle when it's just anything that's extraordinary. And miracles are extraordinary, but it's not something that's just simply unlikely. It needs to be something that's actually like impossible sans divine intervention.
Are
So
you saying that
I'm
when my wife said when she gave birth, this was a miracle, that my wife was wrong?
Well, unfortunately, I think that your wife and many like her and us as people sometimes overuse the word right to describe something. Well, the childbirth, as amazing as life is something that's fairly common, right? It's
Mhm.
not something that only happens, under certain circumstances. It's a fairly regular event. So I
Mhm.
think we just do need to be more careful with how we're using the phrase there. But yeah,
Yeah,
so
you're
when
right. It's the colloquial definition of this is unbelievably amazing and a blessing and all that. Mhm.
Absolutely, yeah.
Mhm.
And so most miracle claims, a lot of people think of like, walking on water, calling down fire from heaven, turning water to wine. And those would certainly all be miracles Jesus performed. But most miracles, at around almost 98% or more of them, are typically miracles that involve healing in some way, usually ailments from a disease. And of course, this is the majority of things that Jesus did as well. So, but how do we know that? How do we separate, someone getting better from spontaneous remission or the placebo effect or medicine and or just some anomalous recovery to an actual like miraculous recovery? And these are good questions. And this is something that's been discussed for literally centuries. The formal term is the Lambertini criterion. And this was actually named after a pope back in the 18th century, mid 1700s, who came up with these criteria for approving of saints. Now, I won't go into the whole process here, but short version is that the Catholic Church has a whole process for affirming saints once they die, whether a person's a saint, and they typically have to have two miracles. It used to be four, it dropped to two in the 1980s. And so when they were establishing this criteria, Pope Benedict the 14th said, okay, these are going to be the criteria we're going to use. So this is a modernized version of that. So this is my kind of like reinterpretation of those criteria. But one is that we have a disease that's medically documented, both the diagnosis and the recovery. So, if a woman comes up and let's say she goes to a faith healing conference and she's prayed over and she says, oh, God, I had a tumor that went away and God healed me of breast cancer. And we go and we do an x-ray and she doesn't have cancer. That's great. But the thing is, if it's the case that she never actually was diagnosed with it, or she didn't formally, like maybe she saw a growth and assumed that it was breast cancer, which does happen. We couldn't verify that. We wouldn't be able to count that because, we had to make sure that the diagnosis was right. And sometimes people in good faith error sometimes think that they're sick when they're not, or think that they're cured when they're not. So we need to make sure that we're getting verifications for both of these. And that alone is pretty hard. Bethel Church, which is very known for healings, often doesn't even, they said that they don't bother to follow up on people because it's too much effort and they have faith, that God heals them. They don't think they need to check. And I think that we should certainly have faith and confidence, but the danger is that people think that they're healed when they're not. And there are unfortunately very tragic cases where people have, for example, been prayed for, thought they were healed of seizures and epilepsy, so they threw out their medication, and then a few days later they die from a seizure, right? And that's
Yeah, we
horrible and
won't run
tragic.
against that for sure.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So the last thing I want with this kind of presentation of this book is I don't want people to be advocating for prayer alone. I think prayer should be an accompaniment of medicine. Let us not forget that one of the gospel authors, Luke, was a doctor. So we should not be forgoing medical care as if it's a lack of faith. Prayer is only for when medical care, it's either to supplement it or when it simply can't work, or has only done as much as it can. So medical care is always important. But that's the first criteria. It needs to be medically documented. Second one is that this needs to be an illness that's organic and not psychosomatic. Now, this is important because oftentimes we can get diseases like paralysis or blindness or deafness where people think and show symptoms, strangely enough, to where they're paralyzed, they can't move their arm. And yet when you look at them, there's nothing objectively wrong with them. Their nerves are not damaged. There's nothing there that should be causing this. But because of stress, because of the mind, it can actually cause us to think that we're paralyzed or blind or whatever.
Wow.
So as strange as that is, and there are actually really weird cases you can read of to where with mass hysteria, like there was one case where a school, one girl got a seizure and then a bunch of her classmates started getting seizures and you ended up getting 20 or 30 kids. Now, obviously seizures are not contagious, right? Like you can't get it from someone. So, and when they did neurological examinations, there was nothing wrong with these kids, like nothing wrong with their brain. So the body can do a lot of weird things and it can make you feel like you're sick when you're not. So we need to make sure that that's not the case, and we need to make sure that there's something actually objectively there. So if someone's paralyzed, we need to make sure they have objective nerve or spinal damage that's causing that. If they're blind, there needs to be something actually wrong with their eyes, a growth, a stocktoma, whatever you want to call it. So those are the kinds of things we're looking for. So it needs to be an organic disease. And that's also how we rule out the placebo effect as well, because we have something that's tangibly there, not just in the mind. Next one is disease needs to be progressive. This should be kind of obvious, but it needs to be something that either wasn't getting better or was getting actively worse right before the time of healing. If someone was getting worse, if someone was sick and they were already starting to get better prior to the prayer, we can say maybe that was some natural process working, and then maybe prayer helped, but we can't only attribute it to that, right? Whereas if someone, let's say, has hearing depth problems, and then they've had that for 5 years, and we look at them again, it gets worse and worse, and it's getting worse. They're prayed for. Suddenly their hearing is better and it stays better. That's really surprising because that shouldn't happen if it's a progressive disease that gets worse over time, not better. That's very surprising if this is some natural law, right? So this is another thing where it's unlikely to be a natural cause if it's a progressive disease that suddenly gets better. The healing needs to be permanent. That should be kind of obvious, right? If someone gets cancer and then it relapses, we might want to question whether that's a miracle. And unfortunately, that has happened. There was a news story a while back of a guy who'd had, I forget what kind of cancer it was, stage 4, who was dying, and he went to go help finish building his church. They were doing construction to revise some stuff, renovations, and he did that. And when he did that, his cancer went away, and people said, "Oh, this is a miracle." The local newspapers. Well, his cancer came back, I think, a year or two later, and he ended up succumbing to it. So,
well, what would you say, Caleb? That makes a lot of sense. What would you say to someone who someone was prayed for and they were healed of, say, cancer? They're let's say it was really extreme or something. We're just making this up for a hypothetical. And then they recovered and they never suffered with cancer again. But 5 years later, they died of a heart attack. We could still say that the cancer healing was a miracle, right? Given that it meets all the criteria.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Braxton. I would say that it would, as long as the heart attack was unrelated to the cancer, that's fine. I don't think it's fair to say that, like, I don't know, if someone was blind and also had a bad knee and they're completely healed of the blindness, but the bad knee, like I don't think that should count against it because it's a different ailment. So yeah,
Yeah.
I will, if someone dies of some other cause that like absurdly, but it's not from the disease, yeah, they were still cured of the cancer miraculously. The heart could be a different issue. So yeah, that's a really good point to bring up. But yeah, so we want a permanent one. And so in the Catholic criteria, usually this is a waiting period of at least 10 years, depending on what the disease is. Uh, and typically that's how it is. So if someone stays remission, in remission for longer than 10 years, usually that's considered a permanent cure, or at least complete without relapses. So we want to be careful of that. And so this is a complicated thing though, because on the one hand, if you do a case that's like decades old, people will say, well, medical technology wasn't as good back then. There's more likely to be a mistake. But if you do a case that's really recent where someone was healed, like let's say 2 or 3 years ago, medical technology is better, but how do we know it's permanent? We need to wait we need to wait a longer period to make sure that they don't get sick again. So it's kind of a very careful balance between, you don't want to get too far back where it's old to where it's hard to verify, but you don't want to do it too recent to where we can't know it's permanent. So that's another thing too. Healing is to be instantaneous. This is probably one of the most important ones. This is really what would separate it from like a gradual healing, because when the human body works, we're made up of different parts and cells. So when we get better, our body is fighting the disease and we gradually recover over time, right? Like if someone breaks a bone, it's not going to heal overnight. They're going to have to be casted. They're going to have to probably maybe go to physical therapy, depending on how bad it is. It's a very gradual process. An instantaneous healing, or at least one where the onset's instantaneous, is not something very common in medicine, especially combined with all this other stuff. So if you have, a progressive organic illness that's instantly cured and stays cured, that is extraordinarily remarkable and something that's strange. So if someone has cancer, let's go back to that example, and you're prayed for and the cancer starts to shrink and the tumor keeps shrinking over like 6 months and they eventually are cancer free, that's good for them, but I don't think that would be necessarily miraculous, because you could say it's the immune system fighting back, right? But if someone
Would
was
you
at
say, I don't mean to break up your flow, but a question about
yeah, you're
that.
good.
So would you say about these criteria that, okay, look, at least with some of them,
Mm-hmm.
it's not necessarily like number one, for example, the diagnosis and the healing were both medically documented. Obviously, miracles have happened that weren't diagnosed or
Right.
documented afterwards in some tribe somewhere we don't even know about, right? So would
Sure.
you say about this list, at least or at least some of the things in the list, uh, this is for us to be confident or have some confidence in determining whether something is a candidate for a miracle. But it's possible you could have experienced a miracle and it doesn't meet all of these, but that's just for what we're doing here for research purposes. We want it to meet these things, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's a very fair way of saying that. We're trying to get rid of false positives. So
Mm-hmm.
now you could get false negatives to where someone could be miraculously healed, and I can't say they were or weren't, and it didn't fulfill all of these, and we're going to assume that it wasn't miraculous, even though it was. I
Mm-hmm.
admit that we're doing that with a lot of these, and that's fine.
We have
I'm
to.
not here. Yeah, and I'm not here to say that God did or didn't heal someone. If someone came to me and said that God healed my broken ankle and they got it casted and it healed gradually, I'm not going to tell them no, he didn't, because I can't know that he wasn't involved in the natural processes. But I can say that if we're saying that God is healing this in a way that is contrary to natural progression, I could say if God did heal you, it was consistent with natural laws, which is fine, but I wouldn't put it in the category of a miracle to where it's actually like contradicting, how natural laws typically work. So that's all I'm saying. But sure, God can be involved, and we just couldn't epistemically know. I am absolutely fine with that. These are just the highest confidence we can get. So we're just trying to rule out false positives, but you're going to get some false negatives. So that's very true. But with an instantaneous cure, that's a very important criterion. So it's much harder to explain if someone has a long history of the disease. Complete, also fairly obvious. If someone improves by 30%, 40%, it's better. But if they're still significantly impaired. Now this is tricky because sometimes you'll have conditions to where, like, there are some examples I have where someone has like an older person has severely profound deafness and they're prayed for and their hearing instantaneously improves, but their hearing is still, it's good for their age, but it's not as good as like your eyes hearing would be because they're 60 years old. I would still count that as complete. Complete really means they're not on medication or treatment anymore. So you can't fault, if an 80-year-old is healed of a disease and they still have the body of an 80-year-old, the fact that, oh, you're not like as healthy as a 30-year-old, right? That's not going to count against it. As long as the 80-year-old is no longer on medications or whatever treatments they had for their condition, that's what counts as complete. So That needs to be said as well to specify some of these. And the last one is healing was spontaneous. So that just means we can't attribute it to treatment. If they were on treatment, we can't say that's what did it. So if someone was having a lot of chemotherapy with cancer, it probably was a cause, right? Medicine could have played a role. But for diseases that don't, like if someone is severely blind, they have glasses, the glasses help improve the quality of life, but the glasses are not going to cure the blindness. So
Right.
that's where the spontaneity comes in. So I
Mhm.
think those are all reasonable criteria, and we get those from just taking what we know about natural healings. We take what we know about medicine, and we're just contrasting that to say, okay, if a miracle is contrary to the natural happenings this way, let's just take the opposite. So okay, healings are usually gradual, fine, it has to be instantaneous. Healings usually happen with medicine, fine, it has to be spontaneous. So that's kind of how we're coming to these. So that's how they've been doing it for the last couple hundred years, and that's kind of the standards I'm trying to use in this work to get the best one. So most of the cases I have are either 6 or 7 of these criteria. There's a couple where it's 1 or 2 or a little bit, I'm not sure. But if it's 5 or less, I typically try not to include it.
Oh,
So
okay. Okay. So as long as so maybe 5 is like a minimum for you. I gotcha.
most of them are 6 or more. 5 would be like an exception. If it's anything 5 or less, I probably wouldn't include it, to be honest.
All right. Ready to move
So yeah,
on?
we can go on to some of the actual cases to give examples of these. So first one is Dolores Winder. Some people like Sid Roth have called this the greatest miracle of the 20th century. This is an older picture of her, but this miracle happened when she was in her early 30s. We can go to the next slide if you want. So Dolores had a very profound case of osteoporosis, right? Which a lot of people know is a disease that causes your bones to become more brittle. At the age of 31, she'd had the bones of a 70-year-old woman. So this caused a lot of pain, and it caused her vertebrae to pop out and to actually deteriorate. So the back of her neck and spine would actually break apart, and so she'd had to have several surgeries, which are lumbar infusions, which they basically go and take the bone grafts from your leg and tibia, and have to use that bone to mend the bone back in your spine and neck. And they did this on 4 different occasions. Every time it would temporarily work, but it would come undone. It would break apart again. And so
Mhm.
this is, as you can imagine, extremely painful and not a good experience. So I have here an X-ray of hers. It's a myelogram from January 15th of 1975. This was later on in the progress of it. And granted, because it's in the 70s, the quality is not the best. But that's an example where we can see, okay, there's an X-ray. There's an organic, objective, stuff wrong here. So we can go ahead and go to the next slide if you want. So she had this for, I think, around 15 years ago. So like a disease that progressively got worse. The pain got so bad, in fact, that she actually had to have 2 cordotomies. And a cordotomy is a procedure that's not even hardly, I don't think it's practiced, or at least it's very rare if it is. You have to have 3 doctors sign off on this. It's usually a condition that's only used for terminal patients. So typically only if you're dying of like cancer or some kind of terminal illness. And it was only used prior to like modern opioids and pain medications. But basically they go in and they burn the nerves of a certain part of the body so that you can literally feel nothing. You're completely numb, just to relieve you of the pain. And again, this is supposed to be for terminal patients, so just to while they're in hospice care, so they're not in so much pain. So because it was so bad, she got 1 cordotomy on her. Which one? I'm trying to remember the sides of it. Okay. On the left side, she had it left her numb from the neck down, no feeling on her left side. And on the right side, she had to get another one a few years later that left her from the waist down on her right side. So she's completely numb on the left and right side. And this is not reversible because, nerve damage in that way, it can't be reversed. And this also left her vocal cords mostly paralyzed. So she can only talk in a really hoarse voice because it affected the nerves of that. So you have this woman who, is in extreme pain. Her spine's broken apart 4 times. After the 4th time, they said, we can't do anything more about it. Extraordinary pain, couldn't hardly even move. So they had to give her 2 cordotomies, irreversible procedures. So she's not in a good situation. She's at this point in her late 30s, early 40s. So we can move on to the next slide if you
And
want.
and so you but real quick, so left her
Yeah.
with partial paralysis from the neck down. So
Right.
she's in a wheelchair now.
Not necessarily. So she actually would have to, she couldn't lift her feet up. She had to shuffle her feet and like lean against things. She can still partially move. She just can't move it up, but she did
Because
have to wear a body cap.
the problem
Yeah.
is that they have numbed all those nerves, so she can't
Yes.
feel.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
All
Yeah.
right.
So she can't feel. So she can still move it, but she can't feel anything. So that's why she can't really lift her feet up. So this picture here, she had a big plaster body cast. She was wearing this since 1961, 1962. So pretty early on. So she'd have to wear this because she had severe scoliosis and osteoporosis to where her spine was crooked, and this was supposed to basically hold her skeleton together essentially. So this again got worse. Her cordotomy made it better for a short period of time, but after she had a fall in 1973, the pain started again in her neck, which made it worse. So she had to wear a neck brace. She had to wear this plastic cast for about 15 years. In that way, again, she's, I think, in her like 40s at this point. She really can only, she's in bed almost all day. She can only get out of bed about 3 times a day. And when she's out of bed, usually it's only an hour at a time, having to wear the
Bless her
cast.
heart.
So it's not, yeah, I know, you feel so bad for this person, and she's, numbed on both sides. So,
Well, I'm thinking about my mother too. My mother had a dislocated hip, and for much of her youth, she had to wear a body cast just like that. Yeah. So
yeah, it's horrible.
this is another thing. When you're looking at these people, these are real people. Like, I look at that lady, and
Right.
I've seen that lady 1,000 times,
Right.
in people's faces. But yeah, go ahead.
Absolutely, yeah. So this is a very dire situation. We're at August of 1975 now. She weighs 78 pounds at this point, and she could barely move.
Oof.
And a doctor at this point tells her, "You're probably going to need to go to hospice care. You're not going to live much longer, unfortunately, or we're not expecting you to," because her health was so poor. So this is a pretty dire situation. And so Dolores, I will say, she was a Christian. I believe she was a Methodist or Presbyterian, I forget, but she was not a continuationist. She didn't really believe miracles were a thing. So she hadn't really tried praying before, at least not incessantly. So as she was laying there dying, one of her friends says, there's this evangelist named Catherine Kuhlman, if you've heard her. She's like, yeah, I've heard of her, but like, what difference does it make? Like, God's going to lead me this way. I don't think it's worth it. She's like, well, what can't hurt? You might as well try. And so after some reluctance, she was eventually coaxed to saying, fine, I'll go to one of these lectures. It wasn't even a healing service. It was a lecture of several people speaking, and Kuhlman happened to be there. So we can do the next slide. So as she's at this lecture by Kuhlman, she's sitting there in her body cast, and she starts to feel her feet get warmed. And Kuhlman at this point is up on stage healing someone else in a different context. And so she feels pain in her legs, which is weird because she's like, I shouldn't even be able to feel anything in my legs. Like, why is it like almost like my legs are burning? So she gets up and starts walking around. She steps out the auditorium, and another doctor follows her out who was attending there from Johns Hopkins University. And he's like, oh, what's wrong? And she's like, I feel this weird feeling in my legs. And she had thought that it was actually one of her vertebrae. I forgot to mention this in the other slide, but because her spine kept popping out, she actually had a slight wound on the back of her neck where one of the vertebrae was puncturing out and was very uncomfortable. She thought that she may have pressed it against something. That's why her legs were hurting. So the doctor comes out, and he's looking at her. He's like, she's like, I don't know what's going on. This feels really weird. And he's like, I think God's healed you. I think you need to trust me on this. And so after some coaxing, he eventually gets her to take the body cast off. And so they take her back inside, and she's on stage, and they're explaining to her like, oh, Miss Kuhlman, this woman has regained this ability. She's had 2 chordotomies and she feels no more pain. And so she gets up there, and she lifts her feet up on the stage the first time, because remember, she was shuffling before this, and she can finally, walk and move, and she no longer feels pain. And she takes the body cast off. She takes the neck brace off. Now, if I was watching that on stage, I might think, okay, this could be adrenaline. Someone in the moment could feel healed, but was this an actual healing? Well, 3 or 4 days later, on September 3rd, she goes back to her doctor, who, first of all, is amazed that she's walking with no body cast, perfectly, as far as he can tell, in good health. And he's like, Dolores, what happened? And so she excitedly tells her, it's like, I want you to examine me. So she gets on the table, and he runs his hands down her spine, and he sees that her spine is no longer broken, like the bones are together, including the wound that was open was scarred over now that had the vertebrae sticking out of it. Her spine is so straight now that she can't even fit in the body cast. Her scoliosis is gone in that way. And he takes a little needle and does a pinprick on her hands and legs, and she moves back. And so her feeling had come back into her legs and hands from the chordotomy. And so he was astounded by this.
They what did they do? Didn't they what did they cauterize or something? All those nerves?
Yeah, they went and they literally burned the nerve endings. So
this shouldn't even be probably possible, right?
It isn't. No. And from what I've been able to tell, both the source I've gotten from this and from my own research, I have not, to my knowledge, and anyone's willing to correct me on this if I want, I'm not aware of any case of a chordotomy being reversed. They've done and granted, there's not many follow-up studies because most people who get them don't live long because they're terminal patients, but they've done 5-10 years follow-ups, and the person sometimes has better quality of life, but they still don't have sensation. They can't feel heat or cold. They can't get arousal and stuff like that. So she had nearly full feeling come back to her body, which again shouldn't be medically possible. And so this was back in 1975. She lived up until 2016 with no relapses. And again, osteoporosis is a disease that gets worse over time, right? And she was in her 30s when this was like at its 30s, 40s when it was at its worst. Even as an old lady, never had any issues, never had to wear the back brace again, never had to have pain medications, had feelings to her legs. And she would go giving her testimony, bringing that big plaster cast to show like, yeah, this is where I used to be in, and God healed me. So that's just at one case where you have like pretty good medical documentation that, you know, crosses off a lot of those good criteria. And I think it's really hard to explain. But,
yeah, like already this is just the first case, and we're going to move on quickly here, but,
right.
but just to say that, like, what this has got to like move the needle a little bit for someone, like, because you hear something like that, you've got the data there. It's just, it's great. You know, it's like,
right.
What are you going to do? What are you going to do, atheist naturalist? I'm just kidding.
Well, they're probably, I imagine either say that, like, you know,
yeah, what do they do?
They would probably either just deny it and say that she's lying, even though the documentation's there, or they would say that, well, we just can't say it's God. Weird things happen. The body can heal itself in strange ways. And so we can't always just, you know, do God of the gaps. And there's a whole response to that. But typically in my experience, they will go from saying stuff like that doesn't happen. And when you give an example, they say, okay, fine, it does happen, but we don't have a good explanation. You can't say God's an explanation. It'll usually shift to that, right? So it's like when you know, sometimes young Earth creation will say there's no young Earth creationists will say there's no good transitional fossils. Then you'll give them a few examples, like, well, those don't count because of so and so and so. So sometimes I feel like they're just moving the goalposts a little bit, depending on who it is. Not all the time, but
well, one of the responses we can give is more miracle cases. So
yeah, if it's one case, you could maybe say that, but when you have accumulation of these, right, then it gets more interesting. So this one is a little bit older, but I don't think it's an issue because the condition we're dealing with is not something that needs modern medical equipment to diagnose, right? Mm-hmm. So this was a French miracle, and it's Mary Le Marchand, but I believe it's, if I'm going to pronounce it right in French, it's Marie Le Marchand. I apologize if I'm butchering that
that sounded impressive to these Southern American ears.
Yeah. So to give it a little bit of a background, this is a Catholic context. Lourdes is a very famous shrine in Catholic theology because in 1858 there was a young girl who's pictured on the right named Bernadette Soubirous, who claimed that the Virgin Mary appeared to her. I think it was about 28 times. I forget how many. And she would have these conversations, and the Virgin Mary allegedly showed her this spring water that would come. And so people would start coming to this water and would report being healed. And these got so common that they actually had a medical bureau set up to investigate these. And so since 1858, they've had 70 official miracle claims. Now, that's actually not that many compared to literally thousands of people who go there every year, right? So they're really strict. They're applying these same criteria that we talked about earlier. And so with those, they get 70 solid ones, but there's about 2,500 of them that maybe don't get all 7, but they get 5 or 6 that are still considered really remarkable.
But like you say, this is a high trafficked pilgrimage site.
Right, exactly. And so the point is, like, not all of these there are some of them that they affirm as miracles that I don't think they should have, that I'm not persuaded by, and there's some that they didn't that I think they should have. So it's hard to measure that. But Lourdes has cases spanning all the way from, the most famous one was of a case.
Sorry, I went too quick for you.
No, you're good. I didn't. Yeah, I should have clarified that. Like, there's a couple famous cases. Like, there's one of a man who allegedly had a bone. He broke his leg, and he literally had the bone sticking out. And when he went to Lourdes, the bone allegedly went back in. The skin covered up in a few seconds, like that. And people would dispute that, and that gets into a really long, complicated thing. But you have cases like that. You have cases of paraplegics, like people who were war veterans who were shot in the head, who were like on permanent disability in wheelchairs, instantly get better. You have people who were blind, deaf, and paralyzed regain it all. So you have really remarkable cases like that. And this is one of the ones, I think it's one of the more well-known ones of Lourdes, for a couple of reasons. But this is a Maui, so we can go to the next slide. So as I said, you don't need modern medical diagnostics to tell what's wrong here. So this is an illustration of what this would look like. But Maui was an 18-year-old girl in France who had severe tuberculosis that caused lupus vulgaris of the face. Now, tuberculosis was very common back then in the 19th century and early 20th century. And the good thing with that is that a lot of, I think it's like probably close to half or a good portion of Lourdes cases involve tuberculosis in some way because it was so common. And tuberculosis has also been a very visual disease. Like it is respiratory, but it can spread to other parts of the body and cause these big sores. And so you don't have to have, x-rays to verify these. You can see if someone has huge sores on their face, it's pretty obvious to anyone. So the fact that this is a little bit older isn't a huge problem. She'd had it so much to where her nose and face were basically eaten away from ulcers. She had ulcers on her legs where she couldn't really walk for about 3.5 years. In July of 1892, her doctor, she told her she wanted to go to Lourdes, and her doctor wrote a report saying, I really recommend that you don't because you're in bad health. And among his the medical ailments he lists, he mentions that she has tuberculosis in both her lungs, which caused her to cough up blood since 3 months prior to that, nightly fevers, and she had these huge lupus sores on her body, some of which were as big as a hand. So another physician who sees her as she's traveling on the train to Lourdes in August, so this is a month later, who sees her writes, I was struck by her particularly revolting face. Both cheeks, the lower part of her nose, and the upper lip were covered in tuberculosis ulcer that secreted matter abundantly. So here's another eyewitness account from a doctor. The most interesting account, I think, is the next one, which is from Émile Zola. Now, Zola was a critic of Lourdes. He was actually a skeptic atheist. And while he was visiting Lourdes to write a novel, he sees her on the train with him. And he describes in his book, again, this is from an atheist who describes watching her. He says, from underneath the veil, because she would wear a veil because, you don't want to go out publicly looking like that. A hoarse voice growled. The head looked hideously like a monster with its hair and rough, staring eyes. The cartilage of the nose was almost eaten away. The mouth was drawn all up on one side from the swollen condition of the upper lip. The whole was a fright of fully distorted mass of matter and oozing blood. Not very PC and kind of, we would say it's probably insensitive by today's standards, but they were being very blunt. So yeah, this woman had very severe facial disfigurements that anyone could see with the naked eye. And so she goes to Lourdes with bandages on her face and a veil, praying to have some kind of relief. So when she arrives at Lourdes, we can do next slide. She, on August 20th, this is a few days later, she goes there and she bathes in the grotto, puts some water on her face, and she instantly feels no more pain and she starts walking, which is the first time, she'd walked like unaided at least in at least 3 years because she'd had huge ulcers on her legs that made it very painful. And so her bandages actually started to fall off because her face had gotten smaller and she couldn't even fit the back on. And so when they fell off, they saw that all her ulcers were closed. It was light pink skin, but all of the sores were gone. And this was like an instantaneous, healing. And so the doctors were amazed by this. And so she was immediately examined by the Lourdes Medical Bureau. And you can see a picture. This is from 7 years later. So this was at least lasting, several years later. She looks perfectly like a normal person back then. Yeah. So you have that. And we have many eyewitness accounts. If you go to the next slide, we have what her own doctor said. So the Lourdes doctors looked at her. She comes back 10 days later, and her primary physician writes, and this is on a medical certificate from August 30th of 1892, saying, I saw the invalid Maui immediately on her return. I did not recognize her. So much was changed. I saw a graceful young girl coming towards me instead of a mass of humanity with a horrible and monstrous face, which I had seen 10 days previously. The tuberculosis has also disappeared. The cure has lasted. And on the right here, I have a picture from a contemporary newspaper back from 1894 called the Sacred Heart Review. And the title there is A Sensation in Paris, Proof of the Miraculous Cures of Lourdes. And this basically talks about how they had a medical panel come and they were basically presenting at a medical conference, and they brought Maui up and were introducing her as look at this miracle cure. And here's all the doctor's certificates. So here's another case where we have multiple eyewitness testimony from doctors. This is a condition which isn't going to be easily misdiagnosed, at least not the giant facial sores. An instantaneous healing that got better, that lasted for several years. I think when she ended up dying, she ended up dying of natural causes, no relapses. That was witnessed by even skeptics. And Émile Zola did not deny that she got better. He actually wrote it, but he simply said that this is something that we can't accept because people are hysterical and the mind can do lots of crazy things. And so we can't accept this as a miracle. And so Zola did not deny that she was healed, but he kind of tried to hand wave this off. And Zola's a really interesting case because on the one hand, he writes that he says at one point, I want to go to Lourdes and I want to see, someone who doesn't have a finger, stick it in the water and come out with a finger. Like I want to see a limb grown back. But elsewhere, he's written that he said, even if I saw everyone at Lourdes cured, I still wouldn't believe because this is ridiculous. We know it can't happen. So you do see some goalpost moving there. And so even when you have this witness, in fact, the funny thing with Zola is there were actually 3 certified miracles that happened while he was visiting. And there was this pretty big year gap. So like he happened to be the weekend that there were like literally 3 cures in a row that he witnessed. And he accepted that they happened, but he still dismissed them and said, we can't call these miracles.
Yeah, but that's so valuable to have a skeptic there who's saying, I mean, I saw this stuff, but I don't know, man.
Right, we can't. So, but I think this is another good example where it's like really hard to think of a good natural explanation for this, to where it's like you can't reasonably say this was like misdiagnosed, or, and you can't, the idea that it would happen this fast and this permanently of a very obvious facial thing, right? Not like it's a specialty diagnosis. It's equivalent. I would say that's almost equivalent to a limb growing back or like a facial disfigurement healing. So,
Yeah, and I wanted to point out to people at this moment before we move on to say that you told me before we started that when you've been on other people's programs, you've used different miracle accounts. So
right.
Capturing Christianity, for example, with Cameron Bertuzzi, you were on there a few weeks ago, and there's other miracles there. So people have a reason. You haven't heard
Mhm.
everything this guy has to say if you just watch this program. But with
Mhm.
that, okay, do we say everything about this one?
Yeah, about that one. I think we had one more, but yeah, and I have about 40 of these cases, as I said, like in the book around
Mm-hmm.
that. So I think having a cumulative case is a really good thing. So you can say
Oh
maybe
yeah.
one or two, like, well, maybe we can write that off. When you have a lot of really good ones, I think it's really a powerful argument when you look at it. This last one is, I think it's Dominguez Kinjam. That's how I'm presuming it's pronounced. And this is Resurrection from the Dead. So I had another Resurrection one on Cam's channel. And I'm a little hesitant with these sometimes because there are cases where you can find, and Keener talks about these, where people's hearts will stop for like 40 minutes and people will pray for them and they'll start living again, right? And those are good, and sometimes it's impressive, but there is a phenomenon called the Lazarus effect where this can happen, and there's theories to how this can happen naturally. But I think we want someone who's like certifiably dead, like Lazarus was in the tomb for 4 days. In the case I did with Cameron, it was someone who had been partially embalmed for like 3 days, right? So we're talking about ones not just someone stopped breathing, people thought they were dead and they came back. We're talking about ones where they're like certifiably, like obviously dead. So
Mm-hmm.
I think that's what we have kind of in this case. So if we'll go to the next slide here. This was a terrorist attack that happened on December 15th in 1999 at 9 p.m. at the Dulaus, I think, Theological Seminary in Jakarta, which is in Indonesia. So Dominguez had been a recent Christian convert and had been at the school. I forget. I think he was a student there. And so this was a big terrorist attack. And these are clips from the news footage of when this happened. So there was a Molotov cocktail thrown into it, burned. But this was by some Islamic extremists who were attacking the Christian church. And so they go out and they try to start attacking people. I think around 30 people or so were wounded. And Dominguez is brought out, and they basically get a machete, a poisoned one, and start cutting at the back of his neck, trying to decapitate him. Right. And so we have pictures here before we get to them. I will warn you, this is a slide where it gets a little bit graphic with the photos. These are from the original media report when the photos were taken, when the news was reporting on this attack. But Dominguez basically got almost completely decapitated. The front of his neck was still technically holding his head together, but the entire back of it, the
You've
entire
given the
spine.
warning, so I'm going to move on to the next slide if you're ready. But you've
Okay.
given the warning, so if you don't want to see this,
Yeah.
don't keep watching.
Skip over it. Yeah. So these are some pictures of the body laying there. So you can't see as easily because it's on the back of his head, but clearly you can see the days and the blood there, right, with the body just being left. And you can see how thin he is already from that. And I believe this was after the body had already been moved. So the next one's even more explicit in terms of what you can see here. So you can see the big wound in the back of his neck, and I have a zoomed in version. And you can see where that arrow is pointing. You can see a little bit of the vertebrae, if you can see that, Braxton, that like black circle like in his neck where the spine was severed, where they would have literally
Oh,
been cutting at
okay.
the back of that.
Yeah.
You can see the vertebrae sticking out. So that's clearly a lot of blood loss there. And that's not something that's like, oh, maybe his heart stopped. Like that's pretty certifiably, if you're not going to survive that, right? That's a pretty bad injury. So he laid like this. They severed him, and then they cover him in banana leaves, and he lays like this for 5 hours. No one finds the body for 5 hours.
Oh my
About
God.
2:30 a.m. in the morning, they find the body, the corpse. You can do the next slide. And they're dragging it out. So this is a picture of them when they find the body and they're starting to move it. And during this time, Dominguez claims that he had a near-death experience where he's seeing heaven and he, sees angels and Jesus and all that stuff. And then Jesus helped him to go back in his body. So he comes back, and as they're dragging him out, he very briefly squeaks out like I'm alive, or whatever it is, like just a noise, which is hard to do because, he doesn't have much vocal cords left. So they're shocked by this and say, oh my gosh, so they put him there and they stitch his neck back together. Not because they expect to save him, but just so his head doesn't fall off at this point. And so then they take him to the Rama Sakit Haji Jakarta Hospital in the morning. This is December 16th now of 1999. You can do the next slide. So this is the pictures of when his neck was sewn back together. One on the right's when he was healed. And so they keep him there, but they don't actually give him treatments because they had, I think, 37 other patients they had to take care of. And he was basically considered hopeless. Like there's no way they can save him. They just wanted to keep it from falling off. So he doesn't get any blood transfusions. He's just kind of left there, no real treatments, and he's still somehow just there, not dying again doing that. So, and you have to take in mind, this is a third world hospital, right? With a big terrorist attack, they just don't have the resources to take care of everybody. They're just barely even getting blood as it is, so they don't want to waste it on him because he's a hopeless cause. So he lays there.
Not to interrupt you, Caleb, but like,
Yeah.
some of this information, where are you getting this from? The news stories or what?
Yeah, news stories, and when he goes and gives this as his testimony as well. So this is one where I don't have all of the medical documentation, partially because it's in Indonesian and partially because it's a third world hospital and it's harder to keep records there. But there is lots of photographs from the news story and stuff, and mentions with the hospital and stuff like that. So that's where most of this is coming from. But yeah, he only weighed at this point about 48 to 50 pounds because he had lost so much fluid from the blood and the cerebrospinal fluid of his vertebrae, which had been severed. So all that's pouring out. And so the neurologist says that he's almost certainly not going to survive. And if he did, he's going to have brain damage and be a paraplegic because, he doesn't have any nervous system now, right? So he didn't get any blood transfusions, so he's laying there. So this is on December 16th. So a few days after that, he gets an infection to the brain that kills him. And again, a second time, he has a near-death experience. You can do the next slide if you want. Another near-death experience, another time he goes back in his body. And when he wakes up again, he claims that he gets up, he sits out of his bed, and he hears a popping sound. And he says that was when his spine was basically connecting again like that. So he gets out, starts walking around, gets water to his face. He's really thirsty. And the doctors see him walking around and are amazed by this. Again, take in mind, the only treatment he's had really was the sewing in the back of his neck. He didn't have any blood transfusions, no real medication. So when he still comes back, he does that. He starts walking around again, and he's no brain damage, no paralysis, nothing like that. And he's released from the hospital a few days later on December 29th as an outpatient. He's still alive to this day. It's a picture of him giving his testimony. He regained the weight back. This is, I think, as far as I know, he's still alive, at 20 years later or so after this. So that's another crazy example of someone who's pretty certifiably dead, to where it'd be very difficult to survive this, and especially to just instantly get up and get healed again. Now, granted, I don't have the documentation for him instantly getting up. That is from his own word, but we do have plenty of photographs. He really was injured. You can see the spine, you can see the blood. So I don't think there's much reasons to doubt all those details that we can verify. So that's just another case that I think is really incredible and means a lot. Another cool thing that I forgot to mention is after this healing, he actually, I forget how long after this was, he ran into one of the terrorists who had tried to decapitate him. And when they saw him alive and in good health, they actually ended up converting to Christianity, funny enough, when he told his testimony. Gosh. So you get these really crazy, ways that this comes all circle. But yeah, that's all the slides that I had on here. Sure. But hopefully that was a good sampler in terms of the stuff.
Oh man, that was fantastic. And I like how you laid those out, and I like I think the woman at the beginning hit me the most, but with what we saw there at the end, a resurrection case is, of course, I would imagine for someone doing your kind of work, that's like the holy grail. You want to find the resurrection cases.
That and amputation,
amputation, and really the amputation. You did an amputation one on Capturing Christianity.
Yep.
But with this one, if that really is that guy laying in the street, and that really is his spinal cord, then what do you want? I mean, that's enough like a amputation type thing, I think.
Well, because now it'll be like, oh, okay, but why don't we have someone who's been cremated who's risen from the dead? Like it'll get, why don't we have someone who's a double amputee, right? Like it'll be like, we can move it back as far as you want, to where it's like, okay, how much will it go? But yeah, I think these are really interesting. And I would say that I think that a lot of Christians might disagree on this. I think the evidence for the historical resurrection of Jesus is good, but I think there is room to doubt just because it's so long ago. And I think that bolstering that with these kind of modern cases in a Christian context really does do a lot. Because if Jesus did not rise from the dead and Christianity is not true, I would expect prayer to the Christian God to do very little. But if Jesus was risen from the dead and is still appearing to people today, whether in near-death experiences like with Dominguez or through prayer, I'd expect, or at least I wouldn't be surprised if there was still rather supernatural stuff happening, just as the apostles did in Acts, right? And even in resurrection apologetics, very rarely was it someone just giving the gospel and the testimony of the resurrection and people converting. There was some of that, but it was also them, raising people from the dead, having lepers healed or something like that's all throughout Acts, all throughout church history. Keener does a lot of work on this. You can see all the church fathers mention this. In fact, Augustine, who's a very famous church father, was originally a cessationist, but he had a friend named Innocent who was healed after being prayed for. And so Augustine went out and he got affidavits from, I think, 70 different people who claimed they'd been healed by prayer. Now, I'm not saying that all those can be verified, but that persuaded him to seriously reconsider his theology in that way. So I don't think that there's a period of Christian history to where we can just say, oh yeah, that stuff stopped happening, especially if you're including Catholic stuff, right? Now, again, we're not saying all of those are credible. We're not accepting all of that, but I don't see any reason to think that any of that stopped. And I think that's a major part of evangelism was, at least in the third world, was these kind of signs and wonders. Now, in the first world, where we have lots of improved medical care, that's not always as necessary. Sometimes it still happens, like we saw with Dolores at the beginning. It does happen in America sometimes. It's more rare, but yeah, you see these in highly evangelistic contexts, especially like with Dominguez, where people are literally being converted after this in highly Muslim or Hindu areas. So I do think that this is a vital part, or at least an important part of evangelism and apologetics, and I'd like to see this really looked into more by both Christians and people who, even if they're not persuaded by it, at least say, yeah, that's something to make me think, and I don't know what to say, and I at least think it's worth looking into, even if I don't necessarily buy it.
Well, Caleb, this has been great. And you have a forthcoming work that isn't done yet, as you said at the top of the show. And so
Right.
we will watch your development on that book with great interest. So we'll look forward to
Appreciate it.
having you back on the show and talk about that book when the time comes. And we'll put links in. But right now, anything you want to say in terms of resources, or you already kind of did that.
Mm-hmm.
What should people get to sink their teeth into right now? At the academic level, the Keener book, maybe, but even if it doesn't give a lot of the details that you would really like to see, but what else? I know Strobel
I got
recently
the
released
Keener
a
book.
book.
Yeah,
Oh,
I
there's
got
the
the
Keener
Keener book.
stuff.
Just wanted to see it. Yeah, the 2 volumes. Yeah, Strobel is a good. At least Strobel, I don't always recommend, but I think his book on miracles is one of his better ones, and I think it's a good one to start off with. Like a prop level, you want to enter into this. That's a good one. I would also recommend the book Testing Prayer by Candy Gunther Brown, published I think in 2012, if I'm not mistaken, which is a little bit more academic. It's not too much, but that's published by Harvard, and she looks at a lot of different cases and basically testing the efficacy of prayer. That one is more scientific than it is philosophical, but that's a good one. Another one, and this one's a little bit older, but I like it. This actually is the book that had the Dolores case in it. Is a book by Richard Kasdorf back in 1976, again a little bit older, called The Miracles. And he is actually, he's a medical doctor, and he has actually photographs and X-rays. Like here, this is of a 12-year-old girl who had an instantaneous resolution of paralysis because she'd had a tumor in her hip that caused her to be paralyzed, and she was able to walk, and the cancer eventually went away on its own. So
Wow.
stuff like that, where he looks at medical records of faith healers, particularly Catherine Coleman, but others, and he says, not every time people are healed, but there are some cases where there's legitimately like verifiable pre and post records we can show here. And as a medical doctor, I can't explain it. One other
Wow.
one I would recommend, and this is more of this one doesn't go into much cases, but it's in a Catholic context by Jacqueline Duffin. And I believe it's called Medical Miracles. And Duffin is actually she's a hematologist from Canada, or a historian of medicine. And she studies Catholic miracles, particularly canonization miracles. And she actually got into this because in the 1980s, she was brought a sample of leukemia cells, and she didn't know what it was for, and she thought it was for a lawsuit actually. But she saw this patient who had severe leukemia, and she assumed they were dead because of how bad it was. And then she saw a very spontaneous resolution of it that had lasted, and she thought this was some kind of maltreatment lawsuit. And she was told, oh no, actually this is for a miracle case that the Vatican wanted to look at to get a second opinion of a woman who was healed of leukemia after a second relapse by praying to the saint, and they won it for the saint's canonization trial. And Duffin was like really surprised by this. And another thing is that Duffin is and she still is, and was at the time, is an atheist. And she told them, well, look, I don't, if you want me to testify, I don't believe in this stuff, and I'm an atheist. And said, that's fine. We just want your medical opinion. And so that got her interested to look into these. So she spent about a decade or so looking into the Vatican's files. And she writes in her book that, like, although she doesn't believe these are necessarily supernatural, she does think many of these are medically inexplicable. And she does think that the church does a really good job of like doing these kind of medical reviews and making sure there's doctors present and going through this long process. So I would recommend that one as well. But that's kind of a good sample. So yeah,
Yeah.
that's kind of what I'd like to leave you with. But
Man, that's great. Well, listen, Caleb, this has been awesome. You're a friend of the channel. We'll have you back. Want to have you to come back and talk about appearances to Muslims of Jesus, and
Right.
and we've done shows on that in the past, but we talked about that, and we'll have you on to talk about some of those things. But folks, hope you go to the resource. You have a YouTube channel?
I mean, I don't post on it much. I do, however, I do show up a lot on my friend Than Christophe's channel called Exploring Reality. He has his own ministry, and we've done quite a few presentations on there. I have a God Does Heal Amputees video on his presentation on that channel, and a couple others. We've also interviewed people who've had miracles, like Chris Gunderson, whose case was published. If you want to look at that, just look up my name with Exploring Reality, and you'll see a lot of stuff come up.
So we'll put a link to one of your videos with Exploring Reality in the description. And of course, you have books and stuff on Amazon. They can just search your name, Caleb Jackson. Caleb, this has been awesome. I feel like I've made a new friend, as I said. And listen, we'll have you back. And to the rest of you, we'll see you next time on Trinity Radio.